High on K2, nothing announces disaster when it begins. There is no warning sound, no dramatic signal, only silence, thin air, and decisions made a little too late. In the Karakoram, at over 8,000 meters, ambition does not fail loudly. It simply runs out of oxygen. This is the story of Daniel Mercer, a private climber who arrived in Pakistan convinced that preparation, money, and confidence could offset experience. He was not reckless in the obvious way. He trained hard. He paid for a premium expedition. He listened selectively. And like many before him, he believed the mountain would negotiate. K2 does not. Among the team was Rahim Ali, a high-altitude porter with years on the mountain, known for his quiet judgment and strict respect for turnaround times. From base camp onward, the contrast between the two men was subtle but persistent, one driven by outcome, the other by survival. What followed was not a single mistake, but a sequence of reasonable choices that aligned in the worst possible way. Here on K2 Stories, we don't tell these stories to assign blame or glorify loss. We tell them because the mountain keeps records, and every season, it reminds climbers that experience is not measured in confidence, but in restraint. By mid-July, base camp had settled into its familiar rhythm, days of waiting punctuated by brief bursts of movement. Weather reports came in fragments, never guarantees. On K2, forecasts are suggestions at best. Daniel Mercer treated them as obstacles. He walked the glacier each morning, counting tents, watching other teams, measuring progress not in safety margins but in proximity to the Abruzzi Spur. Rahim Ali noticed this early. He had seen the pattern many times. Climbers who feared stagnation more than danger. Daniel asked questions constantly about rope fixing schedules, oxygen caches, summit windows. None of the questions were unreasonable. What troubled Rahim was the impatience beneath them. Daniel didn't ask whether conditions were right. He asked when they would be. The first rotation up the mountain began cautiously. From base camp to Camp 1, the route was already unstable. Seracs groaned in the afternoon heat. Snow bridges softened by the hour. The team moved early, headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. Daniel climbed efficiently, strong on the rope, confident in his movement. He took this as confirmation that his approach was working. At Camp 1, the mood shifted. Several climbers complained of headaches and poor sleep. A storm system was forming west of the mountain, still distant but gaining structure. Expedition leaders discussed a conservative plan. Pause rotations, reassess in 48 hours. Daniel listened, nodded, then privately argued that waiting would cost them the window. K2 doesn't give many chances, he said one evening, sipping melted snow outside his tent. If we hesitate, we miss it. Rahim responded calmly. K2 also doesn't forgive rushing. The second rotation pushed higher toward Camp 2. Here, the mountain changed character. The slope steepened, wind became constant, movement slowed. Daniel began to feel the altitude. Not dramatically, but enough to irritate him. He slept poorly, woke often, and grew sensitive to minor discomforts. He adjusted his oxygen flow higher than planned, telling himself it was temporary. Rahim noticed the adjustment and said nothing at first. In high-altitude climbing, correction too early can feel like accusation. Instead, he watched. Daniel still climbed well, but his decisions narrowed. He focused on forward progress, less on contingency. At Camp 2, news arrived that unsettled everyone. Rope fixing above Camp 3 was delayed. A team ahead had turned back after encountering heavy winds and unstable snow. The summit window was shrinking. Daniel interpreted this as pressure. Others saw it as warning. During a team briefing, leaders proposed a longer acclimatization pause. Daniel pushed back, not aggressively, but persistently. He cited his training data, his oxygen reserves, his schedule. He reminded them he had come specifically for this window.
The mountain doesn't know your schedule.
The words landed quietly, but they changed the room. Daniel smiled, dismissed the comment as philosophical. But the tension remained. When the push toward Camp 3 finally came, conditions were marginal. Wind gusts increased by midday. Visibility dropped and returned unpredictably. The team moved anyway, bound by momentum and commitment. Turning back now felt like failure. Camp 3 was exposed, carved into ice, barely sheltered from the wind. Daniel arrived depleted but encouraged. He had made it higher than ever before. In his mind, that mattered. He filmed short clips, spoke into his camera about perseverance and discipline. He did not mention the fatigue behind his eyes or the growing reliance on oxygen. That night, Rahim checked on him. Daniel was restless, adjusting gear, rechecking straps. His confidence had shifted into compulsion. "We should descend tomorrow," Rahim said carefully. "Let the weather settle." Daniel shook his head. "If we go down now, we won't come back up in time." Rahim didn't argue further. On K2, once a climber commits mentally, persuasion rarely works. What matters then is containment, slowing decisions, reinforcing margins where possible. Above them, clouds thickened. Below, base camp waited. Between those 2 points lay the narrowest space on the mountain, the moment when ambition outweighs patience. And K2 was watching. Morning at Camp 3 arrived without clarity. The sky was neither open nor closed, just a dull, moving ceiling of gray. Wind slid across the slope in steady sheets, not violent, but persistent enough to drain energy with every minute exposed. This was the kind of weather that confuses judgment, not dangerous enough to force retreat, not calm enough to reward progress. Daniel Mercer read it as tolerable. The plan on paper was simple: wait one more day, reassess, then decide whether to push toward Camp 4. In practice, waiting at Camp 3 was its own test. The altitude pressed constantly. Simple tasks required planning. Time felt wasted, slipping away with the weather window. Daniel paced. He checked radios. He reviewed forecasts again and again, focusing on the fragments that supported movement. A slight dip in wind speeds. A projected clearing that might last a few hours. He began framing the climb not as a risk, but as a narrow opportunity that demanded action. Rahim Ali saw something else. He watched Daniel's oxygen usage tick upward, his patience shorten. He noticed how often Daniel stood, then sat, unable to settle. These were not signs of failure, but they were signs of strain. By midday, a discussion formed inside Daniel's tent. It was informal, unrecorded, the kind of conversation that shapes outcomes more than any official meeting. Daniel argued that a lightweight push to Camp 4 would position them perfectly for a summit attempt if the weather softened. He emphasized speed and efficiency. "We don't need perfect," he said. "We just need good enough." Rahim replied with a question instead of a counter-argument. "And if it isn't?" Daniel paused, then answered quickly. "We come back down." It sounded reasonable. It often does. The move toward Camp 4 began late in the afternoon, a compromise that satisfied momentum while preserving the illusion of caution. The route traversed steep ice, exposed to wind, requiring steady concentration. The mountain felt sharper here, less forgiving. Every step demanded balance. Every pause cost heat. Daniel climbed ahead, focused, efficient. He said little, conserving breath. Rahim followed at a measured distance, checking anchors, watching the sky. The clouds thickened as they gained height. Wind accelerated, pushing against their backs, then cutting sideways across the slope.
By the time Camp 4 came into view, the environment had shifted decisively. Visibility dropped. The cold intensified. Camp 4 on K2 is not a place to linger. It is a staging area carved into exposure, tolerated only because it is necessary.
They arrived as the light began to fade. Inside the tent, Daniel's breathing was fast but controlled. He spoke with urgency, outlining a summit push that would begin within hours if conditions allowed. He framed it as flexibility, readiness. Rahim listened without interruption. Then, he said no, not loudly, not dramatically. He explained that wind speeds were increasing, not decreasing, that the cloud ceiling showed no structure, that descending now, while possible, was safer than committing upward. He pointed out that they were already near the limit of useful oxygen reserves. Daniel reacted with frustration rather than anger. He questioned the assessment. He suggested waiting just a bit longer. He argued that the forecast still supported a brief opening. Rahim responded with something Daniel did not expect. "Every accident I've seen," he said, "starts with waiting for the mountain to change its mind."
Oh, okay.
The words lingered. Night came without improvement. The tent rattled continuously. Snow brushed against the fabric in short bursts. Radios crackled with fragmented updates from lower camps. Other teams were turning back. Daniel lay awake, calculating. He thought about the time invested, the distance already covered, the story that would end here if he descended. He told himself that retreat now would make the entire climb incomplete. Rahim lay still, conserving energy, listening to the mountain. He had learned long ago that K2 rarely announces its decisions. It simply narrows the space until only one option remains. By early morning, Daniel made his choice. He would go higher. Rahim understood immediately what that meant. Not heroics, not confrontation, just another shift in responsibility. He prepared his gear, knowing that from this point on, the margin for correction was thin. Above Camp 4, the mountain rose into the dark, unmoving, indifferent to intention. And the climb entered the phase where outcomes are no longer shaped by strength, but by timing, restraint, and the willingness to turn back when turning back still exists. Above Camp 4, the mountain felt less like terrain and more like atmosphere, an invisible pressure that erased margins without warning. There were no landmarks here, no familiar reference points, only the steady incline of ice and rock dissolving into cloud. Headlamps cut shallow tunnels through the dark, revealing just enough to place the next step. Daniel Mercer moved first. His pace was deliberate but urgent, driven by the belief that commitment itself would justify the decision. He focused on the rhythm of movement. Step, breathe, clip, repeat. At this altitude, routine becomes survival. Anything that breaks it, doubt, hesitation, second-guessing, costs energy a climber does not have. Rahim Ali followed a short distance behind. He watched Daniel's posture, the subtle changes that only years on the mountain reveal. The movements were still controlled, but less fluid than before. Pauses grew longer. Breathing sounded louder, sharper in the thin air. Nothing alarming on its own, everything concerning in combination. The wind strengthened as they climbed, not in violent gusts, but in sustained pressure that never allowed rest. Snow drifted sideways, blurring depth perception. It became difficult to tell whether the slope ahead was steepening or if exhaustion was distorting judgment. At one point, Daniel stopped and adjusted his oxygen flow again. Rahim noticed but did not comment. Corrections made too late often feel like solutions when they are really acknowledgments of loss. They climbed into early daylight without gaining clarity. The horizon never opened. The cloud layer remained intact, a pale ceiling that pressed downward. Daniel checked his watch repeatedly, measuring progress against a schedule that was no longer realistic. "We're slower than planned," he said through his mask. That
is information.
Daniel didn't respond. Higher still, the route narrowed. Fixed lines disappeared into fog, reappearing only at arm's length. Every anchor had to be trusted without confirmation. The mountain offered no feedback, no signal that the effort was justified or wasted. By mid-morning, Daniel's pace dropped sharply. He leaned into his harness during pauses, resting more weight on the rope. His breathing grew irregular. He spoke less, conserving energy, but when he did, his voice carried strain. "I just need a few minutes," he said once. Rahim timed the pause, aware that minutes at this altitude accumulate quickly. He suggested turning back, not as an order, but as an option. Daniel shook his head, eyes fixed upward. "So close," he said, though neither of them could see how close that actually was. The idea of proximity can be dangerous on K2. Distance compresses in the mind, while effort expands. What feels like the final stretch can still be hours away. When Daniel stumbled for the first time, Rahim reacted instantly, tightening the rope, stabilizing the line. Daniel recovered, embarrassed more than afraid. "I'm fine," he insisted. Rahim didn't argue. He checked the oxygen gauge instead. The reading was lower than expected. When they continued, the mountain narrowed their choices quietly. Wind erased sound, snow erased contrast. Time lost definition. What remained was movement and the growing awareness that descent would be harder than ascent. Eventually, Daniel stopped altogether. Not dramatically. He simply could not maintain forward motion. He leaned into the slope, breathing hard, unable to regain rhythm. Rahim moved beside him, speaking calmly. He explained what Daniel already knew, that continuing upward would reduce the chance of returning safely, that staying in place would only make descent harder, that the safest option was to turn back now. Daniel listened, nodded, and said nothing. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind sliding across the ice. Then Daniel said, quietly, "I don't think I can go down on my own." Rahim understood the weight of that statement immediately. It was not a request for rescue. It was an acknowledgement that the mountain had already taken control. He assessed their position, the weather, the remaining oxygen. He knew what was possible and what was not without needing to say it aloud. Above them, K2 remained unchanged. Below them, the descent waited, unforgiving and exacting. And between those 2 points stood a decision that no amount of training, money, or determination could soften.
On K2, this is where stories diverge, where outcomes are shaped not by intent, but by physics, physiology, and the hard limits of human judgment.
Rahim Ali did not answer immediately. At this altitude, words matter less than timing, and timing was already slipping away. He checked Daniel's harness, his oxygen line, the stability of the slope beneath them. Everything was still intact, but only just. The margin had narrowed to almost nothing. "We go down," Rahim said at last. Not as encouragement, as fact. The first steps of descent were slow and deliberate. Going down on K2 is never simply the reverse of going up. Fatigue compounds. Balance changes. The body resists motion when it has already given everything it has. Daniel struggled to coordinate his movements, pausing frequently, leaning into the rope more than before. Rahim shortened the distance between them, adjusting the line to absorb any sudden loss of balance. He guided without pulling, knowing that forced movement often leads to collapse. The wind intensified, pressing against them from above, erasing the faint tracks they had made minutes earlier. Progress was measured in meters, not distance. Each anchor reached was a small success. Each pause, a calculation. Then Daniel stopped again. This time, he did not try to stand. He crouched against the slope, breathing hard, eyes unfocused behind his goggles. Rahim knelt beside him, speaking steadily, explaining the next steps, the path ahead, the need to keep moving. Daniel listened, nodded, but did not rise. "I can't feel my legs responding," he said quietly. There was no panic in his voice, only confusion. Rahim understood what that meant, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. At this altitude, once coordination begins to fail, recovery is unlikely without immediate descent, and descent requires movement. Rahim radioed Camp 4, his voice calm and precise. He reported their position, the conditions, the delay. The response was brief and honest. No one was coming up. It was not refusal. It was reality. Rahim returned his attention to Daniel. He tried again, guiding him to stand, encouraging small movements. Daniel managed a few steps, then sank back down. The oxygen gauge flickered near empty. The reserve Rahim carried was not enough to support 2 people for the distance required. The mountain was closing the conversation. Rahim sat beside Daniel, shielding him from the wind as best he could. He explained what would happen next, not in terms of outcome, but process. He told him how to position himself to conserve energy. He told him how long he would wait. Daniel looked at him, fully aware now of the situation. He did not argue. He did not ask for promises. He only said, "I didn't think it would end like this." Rahim answered honestly, "No one ever does." When it became clear that staying longer would only add another life to the mountain's account, Rahim made the hardest decision a high-altitude porter can make. He secured Daniel as best he could, ensured he was stable, sheltered, and not exposed to immediate danger. Then he prepared to leave. He did not hurry. He did not dramatize the moment. He bowed his head briefly, not in defeat, but in respect. He turned, clipped into the line, and began the descent alone. The mountain did not react. It never does. The descent to Camp 4 was slow and punishing. Wind scoured the slope. Visibility vanished. Rahim moved by memory and instinct, focusing only on the next anchor, the next breath. When he reached the camp, he collapsed inside the tent, exhausted but alive. No one asked questions. They already knew. By the time the weather eased, days later, the upper mountain had erased all trace of the climb. Tracks were gone. Lines were buried. The slope above Camp 4 looked untouched, as if no decision had ever been made there at all. Daniel Mercer did not come back down. In the official report, the language was spare and factual. Delayed descent, deteriorating conditions, unable to continue, left in place above Camp 4. That was all. But among those who had been there, who understood the sequence of choices and constraints, the story carried a different weight. Not one of blame, not one of punishment. It was the weight of knowing exactly where the line had been, and how quietly it had disappeared. And on K2, that is how most stories end. Not with drama, but with silence, thin air, and the mountain returning to stillness as if nothing had happened at all. In the seasons that followed, Daniel Mercer's name joined a long list spoken quietly at base camp, never as a warning shouted, only as a reminder understood. New climbers arrived with fresh equipment, improved forecasts, stronger training plans. The mountain looked the same. The lessons remained unchanged. K2 does not demand perfection. It demands honesty. Honesty about weather, about fatigue, about limits that cannot be negotiated away. Most failures here are not sudden. They are cumulative. A decision justified. A pause shortened. A warning reinterpreted as inconvenience. Rahim Ali returned to the mountain the following year. He moved with the same calm, the same discipline. When asked about that climb, he offered no drama, no moral framing, only a simple observation. We waited too long to accept what the mountain was already saying. That is the truth many climbers struggle with. On the world's highest peaks, success is often defined by summits, photos, and altitude numbers. But survival is defined by something quieter. The ability to stop when every part of you wants to continue. High altitude strips away illusion. Strength becomes finite. Time becomes unreliable. Confidence loses meaning. What remains is judgment. On K2, the mountain does not care why you came, how much you invested, or how close you believe you are. It only responds to what you do next. And it responds without emotion. That is why the most experienced climbers speak less about summits and more about turnarounds. Because every safe descent is a decision made early enough to matter. On Everest or K2, reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. If stories like this help you see the mountains more clearly, not as goals to conquer, but environments to respect, then you already understand why we tell them here. This is K2 Stories, and the mountain will always have the final word.